June 15, 1982. Frank Castellano watched Sylvester Stallone kneel beside a hospital bed they'd wheeled onto the Rambo set. 6-year-old Tommy Ricci was dying of leukemia. The kid had one wish: to meet his hero. Stallone stopped filming. 300 crew members watched in silence. Tommy smiled for the first time in months as Stallone handed him a prop knife and called him Soldier. The moment hit every major network. Donations poured in for Tommy's treatment, millions of dollars. The kid made a miraculous recovery. What happened 3 months later changed everything Frank thought he knew about that day. The phone calls started coming. Families destroyed, lives ruined, all connected to one dying boy who might never have existed. And now, 37 years later, someone is killing everyone who was there. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Frank Castellano's hands trembled as he turned the deadbolt for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but he kept the mug pressed against his palms, needing something solid to hold on to. Through the blinds of his downtown Los Angeles apartment, the city sprawled beneath him like a circuit board, all glowing lines and dark spaces where secrets lived. The newspaper clipping lay spread across his kitchen table, yellowed, creased from years of handling. Hollywood Heart. Stallone stops production for dying boy. The photo showed Sly crouched beside that hospital bed, Tommy's skeletal hand gripping the rubber knife, Frank himself visible in the background, clipboard in hand, thinking he was witnessing something beautiful. 37 years. 37 years of carrying the weight of what came after. The burner phone buzzed. Frank's blood went cold. Only 3 people had this number, and 2 of them were already dead. Castellano. You need to run. Now. The voice belonged to Detective Maria Santos, the only cop in the LAPD he still trusted. They found Vincent Moreau in his car an hour ago. Single gunshot, back of the head. Same as the others. Frank's legs nearly gave out. Vinny had been the key grip that day, standing not 10 feet away when they rolled Tommy's bed onto stage 7. That made 5 crew members dead in 3 weeks. All of them had been scheduled to testify in the Ricci Foundation class action lawsuit. All of them had been there when the cameras stopped rolling and the real show began. Frank, are you listening? You're next on the list. Through the window, Frank spotted the black sedan that had been parked across the street for 2 days. The same sedan he'd seen outside Vinny's apartment building last week when they'd met to compare notes about that day, about the inconsistencies they'd started noticing, about how Tommy's medical records didn't quite add up, how the boy's parents had disappeared after his supposed death, how the Ricci Foundation had somehow mushroomed into a billion-dollar operation built on that single moment of Stallone's compassion. I should have spoken up years ago, Frank whispered into the phone. When the families started calling, when I realized what we'd all been part of. Self-pity later. Survival now. Maria's voice was sharp. Grab whatever evidence you have and get to the backup location we discussed. Someone leaked the witness list, which means they know exactly who was on that set. Frank was already moving, muscle memory from his stunt coordinator days kicking in. He grabbed the fireproof box from beneath his floorboards, filled with photographs, call sheets, and medical documents he'd been quietly collecting for decades. Evidence that Tommy Ricci's miracle cure had been the foundation for the most elaborate medical fraud scheme in Hollywood history. Insurance claims, fabricated treatments, fake foundations that funneled money from grieving families desperate for their own miracles. The elevator was too risky. Frank took the stairs 3 at a time, his 58-year-old knees screaming in protest. In the parking garage, he paused beside his Honda, keys in hand, when he heard the footsteps. 2 men in dark suits emerged from behind the concrete pillars. The taller one had the build of a professional, the kind Frank had hired for celebrity protection details back in his security consulting days. The shorter one kept his right hand inside his jacket. Mr. Castellano, the tall man's voice echoed off the garage walls. We'd like to have a conversation about your upcoming testimony. Frank's mind raced through the garage's layout. 3 exits, the main ramp, the pedestrian door to the street, and the emergency exit that led to the alley. All probably covered. These weren't amateurs. Funny thing about conversations, Frank said, slowly reaching for his car keys. They work better when both parties want to participate. The shorter man's hand moved inside his jacket. Frank dove behind a parked SUV just as the first shot sparked off concrete where his head had been. His phone skittered across the floor, Maria's voice still crackling from the speaker before the line went dead. 37 years ago, he'd watched Silvester Stallone create a moment of pure human kindness. He'd believed in magic that day, in the power of Hollywood to change lives. Now he was being hunted because that same moment had been perverted into something monstrous, a Trojan horse filled with greed and death. Another shot, closer this time. Frank thought about Tommy Ricci's smile, about Stallone's genuine tears, about the hundreds of families who'd sent their life savings to a foundation built on a lie. Someone had orchestrated it all, had used the biggest star in the world as an unwitting accomplice. The footsteps were getting closer. If Frank died tonight, the truth died with him. The real architects of the Ricci Foundation would disappear, leaving Stallone's reputation in ruins and hundreds of families without justice. But Frank Castellano had spent 40 years making sure movie stars didn't get killed on his watch. Time to use those skills to keep himself alive long enough to expose the truth. His 40 years in Hollywood had taught him that the best escape sequences weren't about speed, they were about misdirection. He needed these men to think like predators while he thought like prey. The parking garage's fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows between the concrete pillars. Frank crouched behind the SUV, feeling the familiar weight of the fireproof box against his chest. Inside were the photographs he'd never meant to take. Candid shots from that day on the Rambo set that captured things the official crew photographers had missed. Tommy Ricci's 4-bag, supposedly filled with experimental medication, hanging empty while the boy smiled for Stallone. The medical chart partially visible in the background, showing treatment dates that didn't match the public timeline. Details that had seemed insignificant until the first family called him 3 years ago. Mr. Castellano, the tall man's voice remained calm, professional. You're making this harder than it needs to be. We know you have copies of certain materials that could be misinterpreted. Frank pressed his back against the SUV's rear panel, thinking of Elena Martinez, whose 8-year-old daughter Sophia had leukemia. She'd seen the Ricci Foundation's promotional video, the one featuring Tommy's miraculous transformation after meeting Stallone, and had liquidated her family's savings account. $47,000 sent to a foundation that promised cutting-edge treatment based on Tommy's revolutionary recovery protocol. Sophia died 6 months later, never having received anything but standard chemotherapy. Elena's husband left her. She lost the house. She'd found Frank's name in an old newspaper article and called him at 2 a.m, sobbing, asking if he remembered whether Tommy had really gotten better. Frank had hung up on her. Twice. The third time she called, he listened. Think about your daughter, Frank. The shorter man's voice was closer now, maybe 15 feet away. Amy, isn't it? Just finished her residency at Cedars-Sinai. Emergency medicine, dangerous work, hospitals. A lot of things can go wrong. Frank's blood turned to ice. Amy was his world. The one thing he'd done right after 40 years of choreographing violence for money. She'd grown up on movie sets, watching him coordinate elaborate fight sequences, always asking him to teach her how to fall without getting hurt. Now she was Dr. Amy Castellano, working 18-hour shifts to save lives, completely unaware that her father had spent decades protecting a lie that destroyed families like the one she treated every day. He'd been planning to tell her everything after the trial, about Tommy Ricci, about the foundation, about why he'd been so distant these past few years, about why he'd never talked about his Hollywood days anymore, why he'd sold his security consulting business and moved into a sparse apartment with no photographs on the walls. The sound of footsteps on concrete, moving methodically between the parked cars. They were searching row by row. Frank thought about the last time he'd seen Amy, 2 weeks ago at their monthly dinner. She'd been exhausted, still in her scrubs, dark circles under eyes that reminded him of her mother. She'd asked him again about his testimony, whether he was sure he wanted to go through with it. She didn't understand the scope of what he was fighting, but she'd seen how it was consuming him. "Dad, you look like you haven't slept in months," she'd said, reaching across the table to touch his hand. "Whatever this is about, is it worth making yourself sick?" He'd wanted to tell her about Elena Martinez, about the 17 other families he'd spoken with since then, about how their children's photographs haunted his dreams. Kids who'd never gotten the miracle treatment the Ricci Foundation promised. Kids who'd died while their parents' money disappeared into offshore accounts controlled by people Frank was still trying to identify. Instead, he'd squeezed her hand and promised he'd be careful. Another shot rang out, shattering the windshield of a car 2 rows over. Glass rained down onto the concrete, the sound echoing off the garage walls like crystal tears. Frank checked his watch. Amy would be starting her shift soon, walking through the bright lights of Cedars-Sinai's emergency bay, completely vulnerable. If these people could find his unlisted address, his burner phone number, they could find her too. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't just protecting the truth anymore. He was protecting Amy and Elena Martinez, and every family still fighting for justice against an organization that had weaponized compassion itself. Last chance, Castellano. The tall man's voice carried a note of finality. Give us what you have, and this ends quietly. Your daughter keeps working her noble job. Everyone stays safe. Frank closed his eyes, feeling the weight of every choice that had led to this moment. 37 years ago, he'd believed he was witnessing magic. A dying child getting to meet his hero. A movie star showing genuine human kindness. Now he knew the truth. Someone had turned that beautiful moment into a hunting ground. Time to stop running. Frank rose from behind the SUV, the fireproof box still clutched against his chest. The garage fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant rumble of traffic above. He could feel the 2 men's attention lock onto him like searchlights. You want to know what I have? Frank's voice carried across the concrete space. I'll show you. He set the box on the hood of a nearby car and opened it slowly, deliberately. The photographs spilled out, dozens of them, glossy 8x10s that captured every angle of that day 37 years ago. But as Frank's fingers found the manila envelope buried at the bottom, his blood went cold. It wasn't supposed to be there. The envelope was cream-colored expensive paper, with his name written in careful script across the front. Not typed, handwritten. In ink that looked far too fresh for something that should have been buried in his archives for decades. That's not, Frank started, then stopped. Someone had been in his apartment. Someone had planted this. The tall man took a step closer. Problem, Castellano? Frank's hands shook as he opened the envelope. Inside was a single photograph, black and white, taken with a telephoto lens. It showed him standing beside Tommy Ricci's hospital bed, but the angle was wrong. This wasn't one of the official set photos. This was taken from outside the soundstage, through the partially open door. In the background, barely visible behind the crowd of crew members, was someone Frank had forgotten. Someone who shouldn't have been there at all. Dr. Sarah Chen, the child psychologist who'd supposedly been treating Tommy at Children's Hospital. Except in this photograph, she was wearing a visitor's badge, not a hospital ID. And she was standing beside a man Frank had never seen before. Tall, silver-haired, expensive suit. The man was holding what looked like a medical chart, but his attention was fixed on Stallone, not the dying boy. Frank's mind raced. Dr. Chen had been their primary source for Tommy's medical history. She'd provided the documentation about his terminal diagnosis, his experimental treatment protocol, even the psychological evaluation that justified bringing him to meet his hero. The Foundation had built their entire narrative around her reports. But if she was just a visitor that day, Jesus Christ, Frank whispered, she was never his doctor. The photograph slipped from his fingers as another memory surfaced, something that had been bothering him for 37 years without him realizing why. When Tommy had gripped that rubber knife, when Stallone had shown him how to hold it properly, the boy had used his left hand. But in every piece of medical documentation, Tommy Ricci was listed as right-handed. Frank remembered because they'd specifically noted it as a side effect of his neurological deterioration, that he'd lost fine motor control in his dominant hand. The child in that hospital bed had been healthy enough to use his non-dominant hand with perfect coordination. You're starting to understand. The tall man's voice was almost gentle now. 37 years late, but better than never. Frank looked up from the photograph, his world tilting on its axis. Tommy Ricci was never sick. Tommy Ricci never existed. The man stepped fully into the light, and Frank could see his face clearly for the first time. Silver hair, expensive suit, the kind of distinguished features that belonged in boardrooms rather than parking garages. Though I have to admit, the boy we cast played the part beautifully. Amazing what child actors can do when properly motivated. The fireproof box fell from Frank's nerveless hands, photographs scattering across the concrete. 37 years of guilt, of carrying the weight of families destroyed by a foundation built on that moment of compassion, and it had all been theater from the very beginning. You used Stallone. Frank's voice was barely a whisper. You used all of us. We used Hollywood's greatest weakness, the man replied. Its absolute inability to resist a beautiful story. Silvester Stallone stops production to grant a dying child's wish? The media couldn't get enough. The public donations started flowing before the boy was supposedly dead. By the time we founded the Tommy Ricci Memorial Foundation 6 months later, we had a mythology that was untouchable. Frank thought about Elena Martinez again, about her daughter Sophia dying, while $47,000 disappeared into accounts controlled by people who'd never intended to provide treatment. About the 17 other families, about Vincent Moreau with a bullet in his head, about Amy walking into her shift at Cedars-Sinai completely unaware that her father's entire understanding of his past had just crumbled. The others who died, Vinny, Rodriguez, the camera operator, did they figure it out too? They started asking the wrong questions. The man's expression didn't change, just like you did. Frank looked down at the photograph still clutched in his left hand. Dr. Sarah Chen, standing beside the man who was now pointing a gun at his chest. Both of them had been there from the beginning, watching as Hollywood's biggest star unknowingly became the face of their operation. The beautiful moment Frank had protected for 37 years had never existed at all. Frank's hands trembled as the photograph fell to the concrete, but his mind was racing past the revelation. If Tommy Ricci had never existed, if the entire foundation was built on a performance, then someone had been orchestrating this fraud for 4 decades. Someone with enough power to manipulate medical records, plant false witnesses, and eliminate anyone who got too close to the truth. Who's really behind this? Frank asked, his voice steadier than he felt. You're not running a $1 billion operation from parking garages. The silver-haired man smiled, but there was something wrong with it. Something that reminded Frank of the nervous grips who used to approach him on set, the ones who were about to deliver bad news about budget cuts or location changes. That's above my pay grade, Castellano. I just clean up messes. Frank studied the man's face more carefully. The expensive suit was real, but there were small details that didn't fit. A slight tremor in his gun hand, sweat beading despite the cool garage air. This wasn't a professional killer. This was someone terrified of disappointing his employers. They have something on you too, Frank realized. You're not doing this by choice. The shorter man shifted nervously, his own weapon wavering slightly. Shut up and get in the car. We're supposed to bring you in for questioning. Questioning? Frank almost laughed. 5 people are dead. You think I believe this ends with a conversation? But even as he spoke, Frank was thinking about Amy. She'd be checking in with patients right now, her bright smile reassuring families in their darkest moments. The same kind of families the Ricci Foundation had been systematically destroying for decades. If Frank disappeared tonight, Amy would spend her life wondering what happened to her father. Worse, she might start asking questions of her own. My daughter doesn't know anything, Frank said. She was 12 when I worked on Rambo. This has nothing to do with her. Everything has to do with her now. The silver-haired man's voice cracked slightly. Orders came down this morning. All potential witnesses, all family members. Complete containment. Frank felt the blood drain from his face. How many people are you planning to kill? However many it takes to protect the operation. But the man's gun hand was shaking openly now. You think I wanted this? You think any of us wanted this? But when you're in this deep, when you've taken their money for this long, the admission hung in the garage air like smoke. Frank realized he was looking at another victim. Someone who'd been compromised years ago and was now trapped in an escalating nightmare. The real architects of this scheme weren't getting their hands dirty. They were using terrified middlemen who had too much to lose. "What do they have on you?" Frank asked quietly. "My son." The words came out like a confession. He needed experimental treatment, leukemia. The foundation promised they could help, but the price wasn't money. They wanted information, access, little favors that kept growing bigger. Frank's chest tightened. Another family destroyed by the very organization that claimed to help children with cancer. "Did your son survive?" "For 18 months. Long enough for me to become complicit in things I can't take back." The man's voice was hollow. "Long enough for them to document my involvement in enough felonies to put me away forever." The pieces were falling into place. The Ricci Foundation wasn't just stealing from desperate families. They were recruiting them. Parents who'd do anything for their sick children, medical professionals who could be blackmailed into cooperation, Hollywood figures who could provide legitimacy and access. "Dr. Chen," Frank said. "She lost a child too, didn't she?" The shorter man answered before his partner could stop him. "Her daughter. Same age as the fake Tommy Ricci. She was so desperate for treatment that she agreed to help create the medical records. Thought she was helping other families get access to experimental therapies." Frank felt sick. The foundation had weaponized grief itself, turning victims into accomplices who were too compromised to escape. How many people were trapped in their web? How many had started as desperate parents and ended up as accessories to fraud and murder? "Listen to me," Frank said, addressing both men but focusing on the silver-haired one who seemed to be in charge. "This doesn't have to end with more bodies. We can work together to expose whoever's really running this thing." "You don't understand." The man's composure was cracking completely now. "They don't just kill witnesses. They kill anyone who fails them. My wife, my surviving daughter, they're watching them right now, same as yours." Frank's phone buzzed against his leg, a text message. Without thinking, he glanced down at the screen and his world tilted again. The message was from Amy's number, but the words made his blood freeze. "Dad, some people want to talk to you about your testimony. I'm safe as long as you cooperate. Come alone to the address they're about to send you." The silver-haired man was watching Frank's face. "Now you understand. This was never about questioning you, Castellano. This was about making sure you had the right motivation to disappear quietly." Frank stared at his phone, knowing that his daughter was somewhere in the city, in the hands of people who'd already killed 5 times to protect their secret. The beautiful moment he'd witnessed 37 years ago had metastasized into something that was now reaching for the only person in his life who mattered. They hadn't just used Stallone's compassion as a weapon. They'd turned Frank's love for his daughter into a cage. Frank's phone buzzed again. Another address. 1247 Wilshire Boulevard, Suite 400. He recognized the building, a medical complex where Amy had done part of her residency rotation. They weren't just threatening her, they were forcing him to confront how deep their reach extended into the very institutions where his daughter tried to save lives. "You have 30 minutes, the silver-haired man said, lowering his weapon. "Go alone. Follow their instructions exactly. Any deviation, any attempt to contact authorities, and Dr. Amy Castellano becomes another tragic hospital accident." Frank's legs felt unsteady as he walked toward his car, the scattered photographs crunching under his feet. Behind him, he heard the 2 men arguing in hushed tones, something about protocols and containment failures. They were as trapped as he was, dancing to orders from puppeteers who remained safely invisible. The drive through Los Angeles traffic gave Frank 28 minutes to think, and every revelation made his situation worse. If the foundation had been recruiting compromised parents for 40 years, how many people were in their network? How many doctors, administrators, even law enforcement officials had been bought or blackmailed into compliance? The medical building's parking garage felt like déjà vu, another concrete tomb where truths came to die. But as Frank rode the elevator to the 4th floor, a memory surfaced that made his stomach clench. Amy had mentioned this building before, not during her residency, but recently. Something about a colleague who'd gotten involved in medical research funding, someone who'd introduced her to opportunities for doctors interested in pediatric oncology. The elevator doors opened onto a hallway lined with legitimate medical offices, but Suite 400 had no nameplate, just an open door leading to a reception area that looked hastily arranged. Temporary furniture, No personal touches, the kind of space designed to be abandoned quickly if necessary. Amy sat in a chair beside the receptionist's desk, still wearing her hospital scrubs. She looked up when Frank entered, and he could see she was trying to stay calm, but her hands were trembling. Beside her stood a woman in an expensive business suit, professionally groomed, the kind of polished appearance that belonged in corporate boardrooms. "Mr. Castellano," the woman said, "thank you for coming. Your daughter has been very cooperative." "Dad, I'm okay," Amy said quickly. "They said they just needed to explain some things about your testimony, about the foundation you've been investigating." Frank's heart broke. Amy still believed this was about legal proceedings, about justice. She had no idea she was sitting in the middle of a criminal conspiracy that had been destroying families since before she was born. "Actually, Dr. Castellano," the woman continued, "we were hoping you might be interested in a research opportunity. The Ricci Foundation has been looking for emergency physicians to help evaluate new treatment protocols. The compensation is quite generous." Frank watched in horror as Amy's expression shifted from confusion to interest. They weren't just threatening her, they were recruiting her. The same pattern they'd used for 40 years, finding dedicated medical professionals and slowly drawing them into complicity. "Amy, don't listen to her," Frank said. "Don't sign anything. Don't agree to anything." "Dad, what's wrong? This could be exactly what I've been looking for. A chance to really help kids with cancer, not just treat the symptoms when they come to the ER. The woman smiled. "Dr. Castellano understands what we're offering. A chance to make a real difference. To be part of something larger than herself." Frank realized with crystal clarity that this moment, right here, right now, was where everything had started to go wrong 40 years ago. Not on the Rambo set, not with the fake Tommy Ricci, but in rooms like this where good people were presented with opportunities that seemed too perfect to question. "Amy," Frank said, his voice carrying all the weight of 37 years of regret, "the foundation is a lie. Everything they've told families about miracle treatments, about hope, it's all been fraud. They've been stealing money from desperate parents and letting children die." Amy's face went pale. "That's impossible. Dad, you're scaring me. Your father is having a difficult time accepting that his testimony might have been based on incomplete information," the woman said smoothly. "It happens more often than you'd think. Witnesses become confused, start imagining conspiracies where simple misunderstandings occurred." Frank looked at his daughter. Brilliant, compassionate, everything good he'd ever managed to create in his life, and saw her standing at the exact crossroads where Dr. Sarah Chen had stood 40 years ago. One choice would lead to complicity and eventual destruction. The other would make her a target. "Amy, we need to leave, right now." But even as he spoke, Frank knew it was too late. The woman was already placing papers on the desk between them, documents that looked official and promising. Amy was leaning forward, reading, her medical training making her naturally curious about treatment protocols and research opportunities. They were using Frank's love for his daughter to force him to watch her make the same choice that had damned so many others. The cycle was beginning again. Frank's heart hammered as he watched Amy reach for the pen the woman offered. The same pen that had probably signed Dr. Chen into her nightmare 40 years ago. The same pen that had sealed the fates of countless other desperate professionals. "Stop." Frank's voice cut through the room like a gunshot. "Amy, look at me, really look at me." His daughter hesitated, pen halfway to the signature line. "Your mother didn't die in a car accident," Frank said, the words tearing out of him like shrapnel. "She died because she started asking questions about the Ricci Foundation." The silence in the room was absolute. Amy's face went white. The woman's polished smile flickered for just a moment before returning full force. "Dad, what are you saying?" Frank felt 37 years of carefully constructed lies crumbling around him. He'd told Amy her mother died when she was 3, a drunk driver, quick and painless. He'd built their entire relationship on that fiction because the truth was too dangerous, too impossible to explain to a child. "Your mother was Dr. Sarah Chen," Frank continued, his voice breaking. "She was brilliant, like you. Wanted to help children, like you. And they recruited her the same way they're recruiting you right now." Amy dropped the pen as if it had burned her. "That's impossible. My mother's name was Lisa Castellano. Lisa Chen before we got married." She kept her professional name because she'd already established her practice. Frank turned to face the woman, whose expression had shifted from predatory confidence to something approaching panic. She figured out what you people really were. Started documenting the fraud, tracking where the money really went. So you killed her and made it look like an accident. Your father is having a psychological break, the woman said quickly, but Frank could see sweat beading on her forehead. This is exactly the kind of paranoid delusion we were warned about. But Amy was staring at Frank with dawning recognition. The photographs in your bedroom, the ones you said were lost in a move, the woman in the hospital, coat standing next to you, was your mother. At the press conference after Tommy's supposed visit to the set, she was already suspicious even then, but she thought she could change things from the inside. Frank's voice was steady now, the relief of finally telling the truth overriding his fear. She spent 2 years documenting everything. Bank records, falsified medical reports, families who'd paid for treatments their children never received. The woman's professional composure was cracking. This is completely inappropriate. We're trying to offer Dr. Castellano a legitimate research position. No, you're trying to trap her the same way you trapped her mother. Frank stepped closer to Amy, putting himself between her and the desk. Sarah found out about the shell companies, about the doctors who were being blackmailed into providing false documentation. She was going to expose everything. Amy's hands were shaking as she pushed the documents away. Mom was a doctor? My mother was actually a doctor? Emergency pediatrics, just like you. She said she wanted to be where she could make the biggest difference in the shortest amount of time. Frank's eyes never left the woman, who was now backing toward what looked like a second exit. The night before she was supposed to meet with federal investigators, she got a call about a child in critical condition. Drove to the hospital in the rain, never made it there. The brake lines were cut, Frank continued, watching the woman's face. But the police report said mechanical failure due to poor maintenance. Case closed. Grieving widower left to raise a 3-year-old daughter alone. The woman reached the door but didn't open it. Even if any of that were true, which it isn't, you have no proof, no documentation, just the paranoid fantasies of a man who's about to lose everything. Frank smiled, and it felt like the first genuine smile he'd managed in decades. That's where you're wrong. He pulled out his phone and held it up so Amy could see the screen. A recording app had been running for the past 10 minutes. Every word of their conversation, every admission, every threat. Sarah taught me that. Always document everything. She said the truth has a way of surviving even when the people who discover it don't. The woman's mask finally slipped completely. You stupid old man. You think a recording will save you? We own half the police in this city. We have judges, prosecutors, federal agents. Your little recording will disappear along with you and your daughter. There it was, the arrogance Frank had been waiting for. After 40 years of careful manipulation, of hiding behind legitimate facades and institutional respectability, she'd finally shown him what they really were. Not brilliant masterminds, just predators who'd gotten drunk on their own power. Maybe you're right, Frank said. Maybe you can make us disappear. But you made one mistake. Amy was already moving, her medical training kicking in as she recognized the pattern. The live stream, she whispered. Frank nodded. Been broadcasting to social media for the past 15 minutes. Thousands of people watching in real time. Amazing how quickly things go viral when they're tagged with the right hashtags. The woman lunged for the door, but Amy was faster, throwing her weight against it. They were trapped together in a room where the truth had finally found its voice. After 37 years, Sarah Chen's daughter was about to finish what her mother had started. The woman's perfectly manicured fingers clawed at the door handle as Amy pressed her full weight against it. Frank could see the decades of careful control unraveling in real time, the polished veneer cracking to reveal something desperate and cornered beneath. You don't understand what you've done, the woman hissed, her corporate composure completely shattered. This goes deeper than you can imagine. The foundation isn't just some charity fraud, it's infrastructure, medical research, government contracts, international pharmaceutical partnerships worth billions. Frank kept his phone raised, the live stream counter climbing past 12,000 viewers. Comments were flooding in, people sharing the feed, tagging news outlets and law enforcement agencies. The beautiful simplicity of modern technology, truth spreading faster than lies could contain it. How many children? Amy's voice was steady, but Frank could see his daughter's hands trembling. She was processing everything now, not just the immediate threat, but the magnitude of what her mother had died trying to expose. How many families did you destroy? Families? The woman laughed, a sound like breaking glass. We saved families. Do you have any idea what experimental cancer treatment costs? What desperate parents will pay for hope? We provided a service, a beautiful, necessary service. Frank felt something cold settle in his chest. Even now, cornered and exposed, she genuinely believed her own justification. That was the most terrifying thing about true evil, how easily it convinced itself it was mercy. My mother documented everything, Amy said, her medical training asserting itself as she began thinking through the implications. Patient records, financial transactions, treatment outcomes. Where is it? Where did you hide her research? Burned 40 years ago, along with her car. But the woman's eyes flickered toward her briefcase, a tell so obvious Frank almost missed it. Your mother was a naive idealist who couldn't see the bigger picture. Amy moved with the quick efficiency of an emergency room doctor, snatching the briefcase before the woman could react. Inside, beneath stacks of legitimate-looking medical documents, Frank saw something that made his breath catch, a manila folder labeled S-Chen, archive materials. You kept them, Frank whispered. After all these years, you kept Sarah's files. Insurance, the woman said through gritted teeth. Against the day when someone like your daughter might need to be reminded what happens to people who ask too many questions. Amy was already flipping through the documents, her face growing paler with each page. Frank could see photocopies of medical records, bank statements, correspondence between doctors who thought they were participating in legitimate research. Sarah's handwriting filled the margins, questions, connections, the careful documentation of a brilliant mind uncovering a vast conspiracy. Dad, Amy's voice was barely audible. She was so close. Mom had identified at least 30 families who'd been defrauded, documented payments that never reached treatment centers, traced shell companies back to offshore accounts. Frank's phone buzzed with notifications. The live stream was being picked up by news feeds, shared across platforms, triggering automated alerts at law enforcement agencies. But more than that, he was seeing comments from viewers who recognized names in the documents Amy was reading aloud. Families sharing their own stories of promised treatments that never materialized, of children who died while their parents' money vanished into administrative costs. The Foundation had made one critical error in the digital age. They'd underestimated how quickly scattered victims could find each other once they had a common thread to follow. You're finished, Frank said, not with anger but with something approaching pity. Not because of what we've done, but because you couldn't stop yourself from keeping trophies. Sarah's files, Tommy's fabricated medical records. You probably have documentation going back 40 years. The woman's confidence finally cracked completely. You think this ends with me? I'm middle management. The people who really run this operation, the ones who make the decisions, they're untouchable. Government contracts, pharmaceutical company partnerships, international medical research foundations. This is bigger than one charity fraud. Amy looked up from the documents, and Frank saw something in his daughter's expression that reminded him powerfully of Sarah. The moment when a brilliant mind fully grasped the scope of a problem and began calculating solutions. Then we'll expose all of it, Amy said simply. Every connection, every partner, every government official who looked the other way. Mom started this investigation, but she was working alone. We have the internet, social media, thousands of people watching in real time. Frank felt a surge of fierce pride. His daughter wasn't just Sarah's child in appearance and profession. She'd inherited that same refusal to be intimidated by the scope of institutional corruption. Outside, they could hear sirens approaching. The live stream had done its work, converting anonymous viewers into active participants in breaking open a 40-year-old conspiracy. The woman slumped against the door, finally understanding that her world was ending. They'll come after you both. Tonight, tomorrow, next year. They'll never stop. Amy stood, clutching her mother's files. Let them come. We're not hiding anymore. The sirens grew louder, but Frank barely heard them. He was watching Amy clutch their mother's files against her chest, and in that moment he saw Sarah so clearly it took his breath away. The same fierce determination, the same refusal to back down when lives were at stake. "You have no idea what you've unleashed," the woman said, but her voice had lost all its corporate authority. She sounded like what she really was, a functionary in a machine that had been grinding up families for 4 decades, finally realizing the gears were about to turn on her. Frank's phone showed 19,000 viewers now. The comment stream had evolved from curious onlookers to active participants. People posting screenshots of the documents Amy was reading, cross-referencing names with their own experiences, building a real-time database of victims and connections. The Foundation's greatest strength, its web of institutional protection, was becoming its weakness as each thread led to 10 others. "Dad," Amy said softly, not looking up from her mother's handwriting. She knew about Tommy Ricci. She figured it out. Frank moved closer, reading over Amy's shoulder. Sarah's notes were methodical, devastating child actor Michael Torres, age 8, hired for single-day shoot, no cancer diagnosis. Parents paid $500 cash, told it was commercial audition. Real name Tommy Ricci, created for medical records dated retroactively. The truth Frank had spent 37 years running from was there in black and white, documented in Sarah's careful physician's script. Tommy hadn't been a dying child granted a final wish. He'd been a performance, a manipulation so cynical it had used Hollywood's capacity for compassion as a weapon against itself. "Stallone never knew," Frank whispered, understanding flooding through him. "None of us on set knew. We thought we were part of something beautiful." Amy turned the page, revealing photographs. The same publicity shots Frank remembered from that day, but annotated in Sarah's handwriting. Note facial features, healthy weight, no chemotherapy effects, professional child actor coaching visible in posture and expressions. The woman laughed bitterly from her position by the door. "Your precious movie star was just as gullible as everyone else. We fed him a story about a brave little boy, and he ate it up." The publicity photos alone generated millions in donations over the following months. Frank felt something break open in his chest, not just anger, but a profound grief for his younger self, for Stallone, for everyone who'd participated in that day thinking they were creating hope. The Foundation had weaponized human kindness itself. The sirens stopped outside, heavy footsteps in the hallway, authoritative voices. But Frank couldn't look away from Amy as she continued reading, her medical knowledge allowing her to decode the full scope of what Sarah had uncovered. "She traced the money," Amy said, her voice tight with controlled fury. "Families paid for experimental treatments that were just standard chemotherapy administered by doctors who thought they were part of legitimate research trials. The Foundation skimmed 80% of donations, and the children got care that was sometimes worse than what they would have received through normal channels." Frank's live stream viewer count had passed 25,000. Local news stations were starting to pick up the feed. Somewhere in those thousands of viewers were federal investigators, prosecutors, journalists, people with the resources to turn Sarah's 40-year-old investigation into action. The door burst open, but instead of the Foundation's security, it was police officers and what looked like federal agents. The live stream had done more than expose the truth. It had created real-time probable cause for intervention. "Mr. Castellano, we've been monitoring your broadcast." The lead agent was a woman about Amy's age, professional but not unsympathetic. "We're going to need you to keep that stream running while we secure this location and the evidence." The woman in the business suit tried one last manipulation, her corporate training reasserting itself even as handcuffs appeared. "These documents were obtained illegally. This entire broadcast violates federal privacy laws. Nothing you've seen here will hold up in court." Amy looked up from her mother's files, and Frank saw Sarah's smile. Brilliant, uncompromising, absolutely certain of her moral ground. "Actually," Amy said, "as Mom's legal heir, I have every right to these documents, and as a licensed physician, I have an ethical obligation to report medical fraud when I encounter it." She held up her phone, showing that she'd been running her own recording. "Everything you've said here has been documented under legal whistleblower protections." Frank watched the agents lead the woman away, still clutching his phone with its ongoing live stream. 27,000 viewers and climbing. Comments pouring in from families across the country sharing their own stories. Reporters asking for interviews. Law enforcement agencies coordinating responses. After 37 years of carrying the weight of that day on the Rambo set, Frank finally understood what had really happened. They hadn't failed to save Tommy Ricci. They'd been manipulated into launching one of the most successful charity frauds in history. But Sarah had figured it out. And now Amy would finish what her mother started. The truth, once unleashed, had its own momentum. 6 months later, Frank sat in the same diner where this had all begun, watching snow fall outside the window like ash from a fire that had finally burned itself out. The coffee was still terrible, but he'd stopped caring about things like that. At 58, he was learning to appreciate different kinds of bitterness. The federal trial had lasted 3 weeks. 17 defendants, including pharmaceutical executives, government officials, and foundation board members stretching back 4 decades. The woman in the business suit, whose real name turned out to be Dr. Margaret Vance, had received 25 years. Others got less, some got more, but the sentences felt abstract compared to the testimonies Frank had heard. Families who'd mortgaged their homes, sold everything, borrowed against their children's futures for treatments that were either fraudulent or marked up by thousands of %. Amy walked in, shaking snow from her coat. She looked older now, which Frank supposed they both did. The weight of understanding what their mother had died for, what they'd spent months helping to unravel, it changed a person. But she moved with Sarah's purposeful stride, and when she smiled, Frank still saw glimpses of the 3-year-old who used to fall asleep in his lap watching movies. The foundation's assets were finally liquidated, she said, sliding into the booth across from him. Victim compensation fund should be operational by spring. Won't bring back the children who died waiting for real treatment, but their families won't have to declare bankruptcy on top of everything else. Frank nodded, stirring his coffee. The money mattered, but what stayed with him was smaller. The moment during testimony when a father had described his 7-year-old daughter asking why the medicine wasn't working like the nice people on TV had promised. How do you calculate damages for a child's lost faith in adult promises? Any word from Stallone's people? Amy asked. He's establishing a legitimate foundation. Real oversight this time, direct partnerships with actual treatment centers. He was as horrified as anyone when he learned the truth. Frank had spoken with the Star's representatives twice, conversations that felt like confessions from both sides. He said something I keep thinking about, that the worst part isn't being deceived, it's how they turned our capacity for goodness against us. Amy was reading something on her phone, frowning. There's a journalist from the Washington Post asking for an interview. Wants to do a follow-up piece about how social media investigation is changing law enforcement. What did you tell them? That this wasn't about technology. It was about Mom refusing to let go of something that mattered. Amy put her phone away. She could have dropped it at any point. After the first threats, after they made it clear what speaking out would cost her. But she kept digging because children were dying while their family's money disappeared. Frank thought about Sarah often now, not with the guilty grief that had haunted him for 37 years, but with something approaching peace. She'd been 26 when she died, younger than Amy was now, but she'd chosen to stand against something vast and institutional and cruel. The fact that it had taken 4 decades for her work to see justice didn't diminish what she'd accomplished. I've been thinking about changing careers, Amy said suddenly. From emergency medicine to medical investigation. There are whole departments now, people whose job is investigating fraud, ensuring research integrity, protecting families from exactly the kind of predation Mom uncovered. Amy's voice carried the same certainty Frank remembered from Sarah. I'm good at emergency medicine, but I think I could be better at this. Frank smiled, genuinely this time. Your mother would be proud. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the snow accumulate on parked cars. Frank found himself thinking about time, how the same moment could feel like a lifetime when you were living through it, and like an instant when you looked back. That day on the Rambo set had lasted maybe 6 hours, but it had shaped 37 years of his life. Sarah's investigation had consumed only 2 years, but its effects would ripple forward for decades. Do you think we did the right thing? Amy asked. I mean, exposing all this, it's going to make people more cynical, harder for legitimate charities to earn trust. Frank considered this. It was the question that kept him awake some nights, wondering if truth was always worth its cost. But then he thought about the families testifying during the trial, finally able to tell their stories to someone with the power to act. "Your mother used to say that cynicism and wisdom aren't the same thing," he said finally. "Cynicism gives up on the possibility of goodness. Wisdom just insists that goodness be earned through transparency and accountability." Amy smiled. Sarah's smile, but entirely her own. She was pretty smart for a 26-year-old. She was. And so are you. Outside, the snow continued falling, covering the city's sharp edges with something soft and clean. Frank finished his terrible coffee and felt, for the first time in decades, like a man who could sleep peacefully through the night.